Lighter than air, lighter than air. Focus question. How have hot air balloons and airships changed over time? Introduction. You've probably seen a fire and noticed it, how smoke rises. You've also probably had a balloon with a string to keep it from floating away. You may have even seen a blimp flying over a stadium. Have you wondered why these things float? It's because they're lighter than air. Early days. More than 2 centuries ago, a man named Joseph Montgolfier was watching a fire in his fireplace. He began to wonder what made the smoke and sparks rise up the chimney. He decided the burning fire must create a gas of some kind. He called this gas Montgolfier gas. Then he tried an experiment. He made a bag out of silk and held the open bottom over a fire. Sure enough, when he let go, the bag began to rise into the air. Later, Joseph and his brother made a bag of cloth and paper that was nearly 12 meters, 40 feet around. When they filled it with Montgolfier gas from a large fire, it rose over 1,800 meters, 6,000 feet in the air, and traveled more than 1.6 kilometers, 1 mile. In their next demonstration, they attached a basket to the bag and sent a duck, a rooster, and a sheep into the air. These were the very first aircraft passengers in history. Soon after that, in 1783, 2 other Frenchmen became the first humans to fly in a balloon. Their flight lasted 25 minutes, and they landed more than 8 kilometers, 5 miles, from where they started. When some farmers saw the balloon come down in their field, they were so frightened that they attacked it with pitchforks and tore it to pieces. Kinds of balloons. The silk balloons mentioned previously were the first hot air balloons. Today, hot air ballooning is a very popular sport all over the world. Today's balloons are much safer than the ones the Montgolfier knew. They use propane gas-powered burners to heat the air, and the pilot can adjust the size of the burner's flame to make the balloon go up and down. Scientists also use gas-filled balloons to study the weather. Some balloons filled with gases such as helium or hydrogen that are lighter than air carry instruments used to study and predict the weather. Other balloons are much larger and are able to reach altitudes of 37 kilometers, 23 miles or more, almost to the edge of space. They carry equipment for studying the atmosphere and for observing objects in space. One of the last great challenges of ballooning has been to fly a balloon around the world. Many attempts have been made at this very difficult feat. Bad weather, fuel shortages, and technical problems forced an early end to all of the flights. Many distance and time records were set, but nobody had been able to circle the Earth. Finally, in 1999, Bertrand Piccard of Switzerland and Brian Jones of Brain did it. Steering. One drawback of balloon travel is that balloons can't be steered. They go wherever the wind takes them. Balloon pilots have control over altitude, and they can make the balloon go up and down to find winds blowing in different directions. But they are not able to steer the balloon in a particular direction. Almost as soon as balloons were invented, people start to think of ways to steer them or make them dirigible. Today, any lighter-than-air vehicle that can be steered is called a dirigible. In 1852, a Frenchman named Henry Giffard made the first powered flight in history when he flew his dirigible in 27.4 kilometers, 17 miles, and landed safely. His dirigible was powered by a steam engine of his own design. His engine produced 3 horsepower, about as much as a modern-day lawnmower. But his engine was too weak to fight the dirigible against the wind. Almost 40 years passed before the gasoline engine finally provided the power needed for a useful dirigible. A brave History of airships. The Zeppelin. Perhaps the most important person in the history of lighter-than-air flight was Count Ferdinand Graf von Zeppelin. He had long dreamed of a way to navigate the seas the way ships navigate the water. John Zeppelin became convinced that an airship with a rigid framework could be made strong enough to be useful. The framework would be covered with fabric and would support the weight of the engines, fuel, passengers, and cargo. Inside the framework would be cells containing the lifting gas. He chose hydrogen because it is the lightest gas. It was also very explosive, so it had to be used very carefully. He named his invention the Zeppelin. It was a huge dirigible, often known as a rigid airship. Count von Zeppelin was a military officer who imagined using a fleet of military zeppelins as scouts and bombers. But he failed to interest the military in his invention. Instead, he raised the money from a private donation and spent a large amount of his own fortune. In 1900, the Count flew his first airship, the Luftwaffe Zeppelin I, or LZ I. The LZ first made only 3 flights before the Count ran out of money and had to dismantle it. 5 years passed before he could raise money for another ship. Despite his short career, the LZ I proved that the Zeppelin could work. The first airline. 9 years after the LZ I, Count von Zeppelin still had not convinced the military that airships could be useful in war. He realized he would need another source of money if he wanted to build more Zeppelins. So, in 1909, he formed a company called Degleg to buy airships and carry passengers between German seas. The Degleg airships served delicious food and fine champagne while passengers sat in comfort watching the countryside below. By 1914, Degleg had carried more than 34,000 passengers and flown roughly 160,000 kilometers, 100,000 miles without any problems. The Great Graf. In September of 1928, an enormous new airship was pulled from her hangar for the first time. The ship was named Graf Zeppelin in honor of the Count, who was still thought of as a national hero in Germany. Nobody had ever seen anything like the Graf. He was 236 meters, 775 feet long, longer than 747 jetliners, and almost as long as the Titanic. In 1927, an airplane had struggled to fly across the Atlantic. 1 year later, the Graf Zeppelin could carry 20 passengers across the ocean in luxury matched only by the finest ocean liners. The Graf Zeppelin caused a huge sensation wherever she went. In the 1920s, many people had never seen an airship or ever an airplane. Even an airplane. People were awestruck when they saw a silver ship the size of a skyscraper sail over their heads. They rushed out of their houses and gathered by the thousands wherever the Graf landed. The Graf Zeppelin made regular passenger flights to and from Germany. In 1929, the Graf made a 12-day voyage around the world. She also helped explore the Arctic and made the first passenger flights between Europe and South America. The Graf flew until 1937. After that, she was made into a museum. But when World War II began, the Nazi government of Germany had her melted down to use the metal to make fighter planes, flying aircraft carriers. People are used to the idea of airplanes taking off from and landing on ships called aircraft carriers. But in the 1930s, the U.S. Navy had 2 aircraft carriers that could fly. The Acheron and Macon are designed to carry several small airplanes that could be launched and recovered in mid-air. Inside each airship was a hangar there where the small planes were stored. A hook on the airplane's wing was attached to the trapeze, which lowered the airplane through an opening in the bottom of the airship. The airplane started its engine, unhooked, and flew off. When the airplane returned, the procedure was reserved. The pilots became so good at landing in the air that some of the airplanes had their wheels removed to save weight. Unfortunately, both the Acheron and Macon were lost in accidents caused by bad weather and human error. The Navy lost interest in big Zeppelins but continued to fly smaller patrol blimps for many years. The Hindenburg. The Graf's success and popularity inspired the Zeppelin Company to build an even bigger ship. This new ship was the Hindenburg. The Hindenburg was the most luxurious airship ever built. At 245 meters, 803 feet long, or nearly 3 football fields, she is still the largest flying machine ever. The Hindenburg began service in 1936, delighting her passengers and thrilling everyone who saw her. Although she was designed to use helium, the Hindenburg was filled with hydrogen. At that time, helium was very scarce, and the United States was the only country with enough to fill even one airship. The U.S. refused to sell any helium for the Hindenburg because of the Navy government that controlled Germany, even though her crew was extremely careful about any flames or sparks. The Hindenburg burst into flames while landing in stormy weather at Lakehurst, New Jersey in 1937. Of course, everyone blamed the hydrogen for the explosion. New evidence suggests that the cause was actually the fabric covering, which was also very flammable. No matter what the cause, the Fury crash was the end of passenger-carrying Zeppelins. Border airships. After World War II, most people lost interest in big airships. Crossing the ocean on an ocean liner was less expensive and airplanes were getting bigger and faster. The Fury crash of the Hindenburg made people afraid to fly on Zeppelins ever if they were filled with helium. But people have never lost interest in lighter-than-air flight. Probably the most airships of all are the Goodyear blimps. In the 1930s, Goodyear teamed up with the Zeppelin Company to build Zeppelins and blimps for the U.S. Navy. Goodyear's also made some blimps to use for advertising its products and haven't stopped since. Goodyear blimps are seen by millions of people every year. Other companies such as Fujifilm and Metropolitan Life also use blimps to promote their products. In Germany, where the Zeppelin was invented, interest in new airships is very strong. The Zeppelin Company is once again building airships. Their new ship is the Zeppelin NT. New technology. It is designed for many different uses, including petrol, exploration, advertising, and passenger travel. For the first time in almost 70 years, you can buy a ticket for an airship flight. The company that once flew the Graf Zeppelin now offers sightseeing trips over Germany. Other companies have started to build airships as well. Lockheed Martin, for example, was the hybrid airship. This ship can be used to carry very heavy and bulky cargo. It will be able to pick up its load at the factory and drop it right where it's needed, especially places that do not have descent roads. Conclusion. Once people realized that air could be made lighter by heating it and that there were gases lighter than air, they looked for ways to float objects in the air. First, it was hot air balloons. Then came Dirigible that could be steered. These airships got bigger and better. They became dependable, safe means to travel through the air. Dirigibles still fascinate and excite people 150 years after they were invented. How can something be lighter than air? What the Montgolfier brothers didn't know is that there is no such thing as Montgolfier gas. The brothers were not aware of something called density. When air is heated by a fire, the air's molecules spread apart, making the air less dense. In effect, it becomes lighter than the air around it, and so it rises. If you've ever seen a piece of wood floating in the air, you've seen this happen. The wood floats because it is less dense than the water. A hot air balloon floats because the hot air is less dense than the air around it, and it lifts the balloon and its passengers up with it. Some other gases are used less dense than air. People soon discovered that they could also use hydrogen or helium to fill a balloon. Both of these gases are less dense, lighter than air. Hydrogen can lift more than helium, but it is also very flammable.